Imagine an ordinary Jewish family somewhere near Bobroost in the late 19th century. Winter. The days grow dark early. Only one room in the house is heated. The father works from dawn until nightfall. The mother carefully counts every expense until the next market day. And the eldest son is already old enough to help. He can fetch water, look after his younger siblings, or sit in the family shop for a few hours. Every pair of working hands is precious, and yet, his parents send him to study. They pay a teacher. They buy books. They willingly give up several hours of his help every single day. Why? Why did people whose own lives were far from easy place such enormous value on education? And why, a century and a half later, do millions of their descendants still hear the same familiar words? Study. No one can ever take that away from you. Today, we'll try to understand why, for so many Jewish families in the Minsk Governorate, knowledge became the most reliable inheritance parents could leave to their children. Our story begins in the second half of the 19th century. At the time, the Minsk Governorate was one of the great centers of Jewish life in Eastern Europe. According to the census of 1897, roughly 345,000 Jews lived there. And in the city of Minsk itself they made up more than half the population. But most families did not live in the provincial capital. They lived in small market towns, known as shtetls. It was a small world where people knew one another across generations, and remembered exactly whose son you were, and who your grandfather had been. It was in places like these that people formed their ideas about what was truly worth passing on to their children. Now, one important note. Jewish families lived very different lives. Some were wealthy, others poor. Some were more traditional, others more secular. Yet memoirs, letters, and historical records still allow us to see the broader picture. One of our guides on this journey will be Pauline Wengeroff. She was born in Bobroost in 1833 and later wrote remarkable memoirs about her childhood. When you read her recollections, one detail immediately stands out. Books were not a luxury in her home. They were as natural a part of everyday life as family conversations or holiday celebrations. Learning was viewed in exactly the same way. Parents wanted their children to read, to understand texts, and to take their place within the traditions that shape their community. And that brings us to a simple question. Why were parents willing to sacrifice time and money so that their children could receive an education? To answer that, we first need to understand what a child's education in a Jewish shtetl actually looked like at the end of the 19th century. But if the answer lies not only in the school itself, but in the family, another question naturally follows. What did a child's education in a Jewish shtetl actually look like? Today, the word school brings very familiar images to mind. Classrooms, recess, textbooks. But in the late 19th century, things were very different. For a Jewish boy, his first school was the cheder. Many children began studying at the age of 5 or 6. Let's imagine an ordinary day. A chilly morning. A mother helps her son get dressed and gives him something to eat on the way. The boy walks through the familiar streets of the shtetl, where everyone has known his family for generations. In a small room, other children are already gathering. Some are practicing their letters. Others are reading aloud. The teacher, known as a melamed, gradually introduces his students to a world of texts, traditions, and shared memory. Not all cheders were the same. Some teachers were deeply respected. Others were criticized for their methods or for the conditions in which children studied. But the purpose remained the same. A child was expected to learn to read and to understand the world into which he would one day enter as an adult. And this is where we need to challenge one of the most common myths. People sometimes assume that education was reserved for the sons of rabbis or wealthy merchants. The historical record tells a different story. By the end of the 19th century, a large portion of Jewish families in the Minsk Governorate lived in very modest circumstances. Charitable organizations provided Passover assistance to thousands of needy households every year. These were tailors, shoemakers, small traders, craftsmen, People who worked hard and rarely had much certainty about the future. And yet, it was precisely in this environment that education remained a necessity. There is something deeply paradoxical about that. The less predictable life became, the more determined parents were to give their children something that could not be lost after a bad year or a failed business venture. At the same time, it would be a mistake to imagine Jewish education as a single, uniform experience. Boys and girls learned in different ways. Wealthier families had greater opportunities. Life in larger towns was not the same as life in tiny shtetls. Behind every statistic stood a completely different human story. Still, the broader picture is remarkably clear. For a great many families, the ability to read was considered essential. And here, another witness from that world can help us. Ita Hirsch was born in 1871 in the town of Trysky, in what was then historical Lithuania. It belonged to a different province, but to a remarkably similar cultural world. In her memoirs, she writes about education as a completely natural part of childhood. The question was never, should a child receive an education? The real question was, how do we make it possible? How do we pay the teacher? How do we balance study with the everyday responsibilities of family life? And this is where the answer to our story begins to emerge. For many parents, education was not a privilege. It was not a mark of high social standing. It was a responsibility toward their children and an inheritance that had to be passed on to the next generation. So why did knowledge become such an important family inheritance? The simplest answer would be this: because Jews have always valued learning. But that isn't really an explanation. The real question is different. Why did education matter so much to people who often lived very modest lives? The late 19th century was a far less predictable world than our own. A failed business, a fire, an illness, a move to another town, new restrictions imposed by the authorities. An entire life could change within a matter of months. Parents understood one simple truth: you could lose your home, you could lose your money. Sometimes you even had to abandon the trade you had practiced all your life. But what a person had learned remained with them forever. That is why, for so many families, education was neither a luxury nor a privilege. It was the most reliable inheritance parents could give their children, regardless of wealth or circumstance. At this point, it's important to separate what was typical from what was unique, what was truly common. Respect for learning, a determination to teach children to read, a willingness to sacrifice time and income so that a son or, in some cases, a daughter could receive an education. And what was unique? The story of Pauline Wengroff. She grew up in a relatively prosperous family and enjoyed opportunities that many of her contemporaries did not. The story of Ita Hirsch is also the experience of one individual, not a portrait of all Jewish life in the Russian Empire. Life in a large town differed from life in a small shtetl. Wealthier families lived differently from poorer ones. Boys and girls did not receive the same education. Personal stories help us understand an era, but they can never fully replace the broader picture. And this brings us back to genealogy. Most people who begin researching their family history run into the same problem. Documents tell us very little. A name, a surname, an age, sometimes an occupation. But they rarely tell us what mattered most within a family, what parents talked about with their children, what hopes they had for the future, what values they tried to pass on to the next generation. That is why the history of everyday life matters so much to genealogy. It helps us understand not only who our ancestors were, but how they saw the world. If your own ancestors came from the Minsk Governorate or other regions of the Pale of Settlement, we cannot claim that they lived exactly this way. But many of the values of that world were probably familiar to them. Perhaps respect for education did not begin with your parents or grandparents. Perhaps it has been traveling through your family for far longer than you realize. Within a few decades, thousands of Jewish families would leave the Minsk Governorate. Some would sail to America. Others would make their way to Palestine. Still others would build new lives elsewhere in the Russian Empire. They could not take their homes with them. They could not preserve every custom or every part of the world they had known. Sometimes they lost everything they owned. But children who had learned to read and to study carried something that fit neither in trunks nor in suitcases. They carried it in their minds, in their habits, and in the values their parents had given them. And perhaps that is why, 150 years later, millions of descendants still hear the same familiar words. Study. It is the most valuable thing you will ever possess. And now I'd love to hear from you. What did your parents, grandparents, or great-grandparents believe was the greatest inheritance a family could pass on to its children?